We're delighted that this episode is sponsored by our good friends at DGR Slatter Decorators in Jersey.
Like us, they're a family that cares, and family is the cornerstone of everything that they do.
With 47 years of experience spanning 3 generations, they've built a legacy of excellence and expertise.
So whether you're looking to add a splash of colour to your living room, revamp your bedroom with some intricate wallpaper, or maybe you want a complete home makeover, dgrslatter.com are there to make your vision a reality.
Most people who suffer with emetophobia or a fear of sick or vomit believe that they are the only ones who are suffering. And yet in 25 years of therapy, it's the most common phobia that we work with.
I think most people who have emetophobia feel entirely consumed by it. It dominates so many parts of your life, from avoiding places like doctor's surgery, not eating certain foods, maybe even OCD behaviours like hand washing, health anxiety because you're absolutely petrified of any virus or germ. And that's why it just takes hold of so many people's lives.
I mean, it is there's 2 types of phobia. There's a simple phobia, which might be a fear of dogs, cats, birds, confined spaces, and a complex phobia. And this is the most complex of phobias because it reaches into obsessive compulsive behaviours, like you say, and so many different areas of someone's life, and it can be so debilitating to the point that people don't have children. People sometimes don't even leave the house.
Yeah, but the great news is, and I think this is the overriding message that I want to talk about today, Nick, is that, you know, if you have got emetophobia, you absolutely can overcome it. And our philosophy is very much based upon, you can definitely overcome it, but the way to do that is by understanding the origins. And so many people go, but I don't know how my emetophobia started. And obviously we know how to help guide people to find that start. And a great example of somebody who believed that they didn't really know how their phobia started, and I don't even think that she knew that it had a name, and a lot of people say that, don't they? That I fear sickness and vomit.
That's right. Or I fear I struggle to leave the house. I've got a lot of people say they've got generalized anxiety disorder. They've been diagnosed with that. There's so many people that get so many different diagnoses. And yet it all stems back to emetophobia.
Absolutely.
And it's so common. And as you're saying, Eva, that I think the starting point is you weren't born with it. Yeah. No one is born with emetophobia, and therefore you can absolutely overcome it.
So really excited to sort of share with you all that we've got somebody here with us today and introduce you to somebody who has lived with emetophobia but has overcome it also, and also wasn't quite sure how she acquired emetophobia, but surprisingly the way that she did was one of the most common. So welcome, Charlotte.
Hi.
To our handbook to happiness.
Excited to be here. Thank you very much.
So I think, how long ago did we meet?
I reckon it must be about 2.5 years ago now. I reckon was the first workshop I came to.
Yeah, because you came to one of our workshops, didn't you?
Yeah, I came to Bristol.
And did you know that you had emetophobia? Could you describe it? What did you believe you had? How did it affect your life?
So by the time I came to a workshop, I knew it was emetophobia, but it was only during lockdown, watching you guys on the YouTubes, and I got your books and things, that I actually realised what I had. So I actually had talking therapy during lockdown, and she kind of pinpointed more like an eating disorder, an OCD, and I was like, yeah, totally made sense. But there obviously we didn't talk about where it had come from or anything like that. I had so many previous therapists that said, one lady I remember said that I was trying to be Superwoman because I had 3 brothers, and I apparently was trying to prove a point to them. That's why I was doing all these things and going out and being busy, because that's what I thought all this came from, that I was overworking myself or overdoing things. And this is where this therapist kind of said that I was going with it, because I got into these weird routines and the way I was eating. Absolutely bizarre. So no, I had no idea what it was or where it came from.
Isn't that very interesting though, how people have different opinions
Yeah.
of how you describe a situation, and
Yeah.
then everyone's got a different opinion of it. And instead of going, right, okay, when did this start?
Yeah.
Right? And looking and doing a timeline, as we always say.
But I'm guessing what your therapist was doing, which often does happen, is that as opposed to looking for the cause and what it actually is, they're looking and addressing the symptoms. And please don't take this wrong, because, and I know that we say this to a lot of people, that you actually might not realize, you talk about all the things that are going wrong and all the things that you can't do, all the things that you can't eat, all the rituals that you have to implement into your life because of it. But actually, a lot of people actually are getting it wrong. It's not about the symptoms. It's about what actually happened, and get it down to the bare bones.
Yeah.
Because what you described there, the eating, the rituals, that is all symptoms of emetophobia.
And I think that's a really good point, because I think, like you were saying, that you go to a lot of therapists who will end up ultimately, specifically with emetophobia, it happens with all things, but emetophobia specifically, end up giving you more and more labels, which make you feel so much worse. And the reason being is that because emetophobia is such an all-encompassing phobia, and therefore it spreads out to so many things, like you mentioned, eating, places you can go, things you can do, you said you created all these behaviors because of it. Then as a result, when you go to therapists and they'll go, oh, you've got that must be OCD, or you've got that's health anxiety, and you end up with all these labels, and it feels so much worse.
Absolutely.
Whereas with a lot of other phobias, when you mentioned about the difference between simple and complex, a lot of them don't spread as much. It's all very much edging on one thing. So the doctor or therapist, whoever you see, will say, oh, that's just that. So I think that's why emetophobia is even more at risk of making people feel so overwhelmed and like they've got so many issues, when, like you said, if you looked back to the cause, you'd realise it's actually all stems from one thing. It's not all these different things.
Well, let me ask you, Charlotte, then. So how did you feel being told that you had an eating disorder?
Bizarre, because actually I'm not underweight, I'm not overweight. I kind of felt like I ate like a normal person, like I would still sit and eat with my family. I didn't feel guilty when I ate or anything like that. I still had it was more a delayed reaction, to say if it was an eating disorder that comes with obviously emetophobia. It was more like, so once I ate, and in the evening when I started to panic and think, oh my God, I'm going to be sick, what's going to happen? It would be like, right, what have I had today? And I would have to write down a list of ingredients, where it's come from, where would it be? And then the next day I'd be like, right, well, I'll make sure I only eat bland foods, because then tomorrow night I'll get some sleep, because I wouldn't have eaten like some chicken or anything like that,
So my question was going to be, so how did it affect your life? So we know that obviously you'd eat something and then if worry afterwards. I didn't know that bit actually with yourself. And then it obviously affected your sleep. And then
sleep was a huge one. So like insomnia, I never slept. And I'm very grateful for my mum actually, because it would be every night between midnight and 4 o'clock, I would be on the phone to her constantly, sat up in my bathroom doing my weird little rituals, sat downstairs outside the back door saying that like I'm going to die, that like I'm going to be sick. And she's like, right, what have you eaten today? Let's go through it. This isn't going to happen. This is normal. And I think the trouble is with emetophobia, when you start to have panic attacks and anxiety attacks, it's a vicious circle, isn't it? Because your body, then your bowels start to move around, and then you start to feel sick, and then you get the trembles, and then your mouth is dry, and then I think, oh my God, well, this is happening, so then I'm going to be sick, and then it starts again, and then you think, oh my God, yeah, I'm going to be sick, and it just trying to come down from that, but it was just constant all the time. So then that's why when you would drive in a car, I'd be like, well, if I'm sick, like I can't be sick in a car, or like I can't be sick in a room. I need to know where the exits are. And like at a restaurant, if I eat something that's funny, like I'm going to be sick here and I can't do that. And it just, all the time, everything, your brain is just constantly ticking. It's just mentally draining.
So when you came to our workshop, what did you expect? And what did you expect to get from that?
If I'm honest, I was so concerned about getting in the car and making it to the workshop without having a panic attack, because I was going on my own. It was a huge step, but also I knew I had to change from that day on, because literally a couple of weeks ago, I sat down with my husband and he was like, what is the matter? And I was like, I don't want to be here anymore. I was like, I can't do it. I can't mentally, physically, emotionally keep worrying about stuff all the time. And I didn't want it to pass on to the kids. And, you know, my mum wasn't sleeping because I was up, and James just didn't understand. And it was just constant. And then you get the people who are like, oh, well, you don't look like there's anything wrong with you. So there is nothing wrong with you. And then I was just want to shut everyone out. And I just was like, I'm done. But I do have some self-confidence. And I was like, do you know what? Absolutely not. Like, this has to stop now. So it was like the last resort. So I knew I had to come away with something, if anything. And I knew it was going to be a work. You know, I had read the books and watched the videos. So I knew I had to work on myself.
Yeah. So it was our books you read and our videos?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what was it? Because I know that there'll probably be a lot of people listening who are struggling with emetophobia or any phobia, really, because our process does work in the same sort of format. What was it that helped you to overcome emetophobia, and are you over it?
So yes, I am 100% over it. I have absolutely zero anxiety. I haven't had one panic attack since that first workshop. I have not picked up the phone to my mum. My mum's like, are you okay? Like, mum's like, can I sleep? Yeah, literally. Yeah. Like, I have had absolutely nothing. And there were two parts of that workshop which did it for me. So the first one was when obviously we queue up and we get 5 minutes with you guys, and I got the time with Nick. And I can remember so clearly going up to him and be like, right, okay, so I had a panic attack in my car, and my mum and dad were there, but it was on the way back from being at my nan and granddad's, and my nan had just died, so I think it was from that. He was like, okay, and so what happened after that panic attack? I was like, well, the rest of my life. I was like, you know, it's ruined me, like I'm now anxious, don't know what it is, rada. And he was like, okay, tell me again. And I was like, okay. I was in the car, I had a panic attack, my mum was like this, my dad couldn't pull over because we were in the fast lane on the way back from my nan's, and he was like, okay, and what actually happened? I was like, the rest of my life, like, you know, trying to say. And he was like, but what happened after your panic attack? And I was like, well, nothing. He was like, okay, nothing. I was like, yes, but, you know, I did try and kind of argue it. And then he said it again, and he was like, tell me again what happened. And he was like, nothing. And he was like, you have been panicking for 11 years about nothing. And I was like, well, okay, thank you. Like, and then kind of like, oh, we got shuffled off on this next one. But the word nothing, like I say all the time, like in your accent, I'm not going to try and do it because I can't do it, like nothing. It just stuck in my head. And I was just like, I haven't physically been sick this whole time that I have had emetophobia. I've done 2 pregnancies. I've done sickness bugs. I haven't had anything. And I was like, maybe he's actually right. I've been panicking about nothing.
Yeah. So all those times when you rang your mum between 12 and 4 in the morning.
Yeah.
Because you thought you were going to be sick.
Yeah.
And you had all the anxiety that created more of a feeling of being sick and wanting to go to the toilet. Nothing ever happened.
Nothing. No. Nothing ever happened.
And that was a big realisation for you?
Huge. Yeah, absolutely. And I can just remember all those such individual feelings of like my insides, and I would just try and focus so hard on like what gut movement that was and why that would be and what's going to happen afterwards, and the way I would even like sit on a toilet and make sure my bins were emptied, and, you know, just to make sure because something would happen, you know. And I was just like, nothing has ever happened. And well, I went home and James was just like, I could have told you that for free. And I was like, it's just not the same effect whatsoever. Yeah. But, you know, so that was one of the main things. And then the second one was 100% the timeline. I always thought it, because I can remember the car journey and my dad saying like, oh my, like, my dad's like a gentle giant. It wasn't shouting. It was just like, oh, we're on a motorway. I'm in the fast lane.
So just explain. So how old were you at this point?
So I would have been 16, maybe on the verge of 17.
So you're in the car with your parents?
In the car, yeah. Me, my brother, dad's driving, mum's in the passenger seat. And I'm like, whoa. I feel a bit funny. Like, just started, I was like, I didn't know what it was, because I'd never had a panic attack before. I was like, I think I'm going to be sick. And mum was like, oh, God, like mum's a bit of a warrior. So she's like, oh, okay. She's like, Jack. Like, and dad's like, well, Julie, I can't do anything. I'm in the fast lane, you know? And that was kind of it. And she was just like, breathe. And that's my main focus. And I always thought that's exactly where it had come from. And I could never understand. And I always put it down to my nan dying, because that's the journey that it came from.
That's what you believed was the start. Then coming to our workshop.
But just going back to that. So you were having a panic attack, but was the panic attack caused you to feel sick, or was the feeling of sick that caused the panic attack?
I think the panic attack caused me to feel sick because I think I was sat there thinking of things, start to panic, and then or just feel upset or whatever, and then obviously in a second I'll explain, but then the situation with my dad talking and where we had to go, and then it just stuck. So then with the timeline, I realised that was more a trigger than anything.
Exactly. And I think that's something that's so common, and so many people with emetophobia will tell us about where they think that their phobia started because they remember this sort of event that really stands out when they were panicking and it was awful. And quite often, actually, that isn't where it started. That is actually a phobic
because that
response.
stands out the most because that is your first phobic response, and the first time that you usually have a panic attack, and that's when it feels worse.
And that's often why people go to therapy and don't get better, because they will go and say to the therapist, this is when it started, in this awful moment when I was panicking and this thing happened. And actually, that's just the first time they were reacting. It's the first time they felt, because of what had ever happened before that, they in that moment felt so panicky, had this panic attack, it was awful, and that's their first memory of it.
And that's
even
why
though something came before.
Yes, and that's why so many people feel that they're broken and that they can't get fixed, because they're assuming the wrong event that started their
And it
phobia.
might make them feel better still. It might make you feel
course.
better because you can sort of take the pain out of that specific memory, and that can feel better and not as bad, and that will help. But the only way to completely
Eradicate.
sort of destroy that foundation is to get to what came before that.
And that's where our timeline comes in, obviously, because we are big advocates of, how can you fix something if you don't know when it started to break? And so then you went home and followed our instruction about complete a timeline, and then you did discover
I
where
did. And don't get me wrong, it took a little while. It didn't just happen overnight. I had to keep going back to the timeline. I had specific things in my life which I thought it had come from. So like when I was 10, we moved from Reading to Somerset. Really hard time in my life. I hated my mum and dad for doing it. And I thought, maybe it was the loss of people, because I kept going back to my nan. But I just kept delving deeper and deeper. And I was like, maybe it was friends, maybe it was bullies and stuff. Then you had to go deeper and deeper. And actually it came out that I've only ever been sick twice in my life. And the first time was when I was 4. And I explained this to my mum and dad, and they were like, I can't even remember that. And I was sick, and my mum wasn't there, because I can remember being sick, shouting, Daddy, as I was sick. And Dad came up, and don't get me wrong, again, I think he didn't like it when I explained it to him. He wasn't angry. He was just like, oh God, are you okay? Yeah. And actually, I can't remember how he cleaned it up or anything after that, but I can just remember vomit, Dad coming in, and that. And so I wrote that down as my memory. And then as I went from there and carried on, I had the memory again of the last day of year 6 when I was 10. Again, I was sick upstairs, and my mum wasn't very well at the same time. So my dad was kind of looking after me and my mum. And again, I can remember sitting over the bed and going, Dad, I'm going to be sick. He's like, well, don't do it over me, like move over. And it's that same, not panic, it was just that same voice and how he reacted.
But I think as a child you would interpret that as panic, and that's a really good point, is that often people judge what would they see as traumatic now rather than what would they see as traumatic back then when they were a child. And back then that would have been traumatic to you. Your dad going, oh God, don't do that. You would have been thinking, well, Dad doesn't normally react like that. So that would be traumatic. Your parent that you're looking to for reassurance in that moment, just not his fault, but he didn't give it to you in the way he should have done or normally would, that therefore you interpret that as there's got to be something really bad here in the situation. So it's traumatic then, isn't it?
It is. And also, I don't think your dad was panicking. It was the urgency, most likely. Your dad probably, oh gosh, what do I need to do?
Of course,
as any parent would.
Yeah.
But again, as a child, you don't have that information of that's a parental response. And the child sees their parent reacting, misinterprets it, assumes that, oh my gosh, I'm about to be sick, and my grown-up is panicking. This must mean that this is something really bad and scary. And then boom, you create this phobic schema, this behavioural reference, that then anytime anything to do with vomit, that's, you start to panic. And that is a great example of how everybody's phobia starts.
But also what you've got within that is the fact that your dad's response of saying, well, don't do it over me, You've then got the confusion of, well, what do I do? Right?
Yeah.
Because you're used to your parents telling you what to do, and suddenly he's telling you what not to do, but not telling you what to do. So you're absolutely confused as well.
Yeah.
So you're in a and when we're in a confused state, that's when we tend to create protection schemas, and that's all this is. This is a schema to protect you from vomiting in the future.
Yeah.
So, how long have you been emetophobia free?
So, well, I'd go from the workshop, 100%. So, yeah, about 2.5 years.
So you've now been emetophobia free for 2.5 years. You don't need to ring your mum every 5 minutes at night anymore.
Not at all.
And how else has life changed for you?
Just in just every way possible. Like, I love sleep. I love my bed. I don't worry about having a kebab at 10:30 at night and thinking, oh my God, what's it going to be like? I just enjoy everything. Like, we've been on holiday and there was not one, because again, like traveling on an airplane and all that, not one panic attack. I actually cried with happiness, and that was only just in April that we went. When we landed, I was like, I've done it with no panic whatsoever. I'm so happy that I'm here, and had the best holiday. And actually, James had food poisoning or something on holiday. Again, we shared a bed in the same room. Nothing.
Amazing.
I felt nothing. I was just like, oh, poor you. I'm going down to the pool. I'll see you in an hour. Like, I'll get you some medication. That's it.
I've got to say, in all of that, the bit that's thrown me the most is like having a kebab at 10:30 at night.
I love it.
I mean, that's like the worst possible thing someone with emetophobia could do.
Yeah, it just doesn't bother me. And actually, the main question, obviously, because I was at a recent workshop for you guys, and someone came up to me and said, "But how do you feel if you were sick?" Because I think they think that's the main thing is once you're cured, what happens when you're next sick? And I just said, I actually will feel very grateful, because I've learned so much from you guys to be like, well, if you're not sick, then you're not well. You need to be sick to make you better. And I feel 100% ready. Like, if there was like a bomb going off, I'd be like, right, I've got my water and my things in the back garden ready. Like, I just feel so ready for it. And I don't feel worried about it. And the same with the kids, because normally James would be like, I've got it, I'm on it, and I wouldn't be near them. But I just feel
Can be
fine.
a mum again.
I just don't worry about it. Like, it will happen when it happens.
And also, that's the interesting thing. So 2.5 years on, you've not been sick. Right? And that's a strange thing, because people that suffer with emetophobia think that other people are being sick all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I thought people were sick all the time, like with sickness bugs at school, like on nights out and things. And that's one thing I've definitely managed to socialise a bit more, because like alcohol is a huge thing with friendship groups and things. And even that, I'm quite happy to watch someone be sick and be drunk. I'm like, God, it's not me.
You know, I've got to say, Charlotte, you are a huge inspiration, and I just need to say thank you on behalf of all of us and anybody out there who's listening who has emetophobia. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for sharing.
I've still got a couple of questions though, because I know you're sort of like.
But I just wanted to.
Yeah, I know you did, but just a couple of questions.
Yeah,
Sorry,
go for it.
you said that you suffered for 11 years with emetophobia, but obviously then when you do the timeline, you found out that this really happened at the age of 4.
Yeah.
And in our experience, anyone who has emetophobia, it's prior to 8 usually, right?
Yeah.
So you had this at the age of 4. So how long have you actually had it? Because I'm looking at you. I mean, I know you.
How old are you now?
33 now.
Okay,
Right,
29
okay.
years.
Oh, there you go.
Right.
Oh, then minus
a
2
long
that
time.
she could. Minus the 2 that she.
Oh, yeah,
because
minus
it's
2.
27.
Yeah, right.
27 years.
Oh, well, there you go. 27 years.
So the thing is, before you came to see us, you'd had this long. I mean, you've had it for 27 years. You've not had it for 2.5, right? And,
Yeah.
And sometimes, because you said you had to work in it for a while, it takes your brain time to process it, because you essentially had never known life without it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just been part of my life for forever, for as long as I can remember. Absolutely. So yeah.
And I think that makes people feel they can't get over it because they've never known any different.
Yes.
But you're a great example that even though you didn't know any different, that now you can be.
But also still, it's still really important to work on yourself with that as well. Like it doesn't just go overnight, you know, and I still have all my books and all my things that I've written out, like my goals and everything are still there. And I make sure when I go up to bed, that's like my me time now.
Yeah.
So I get those books out and I'm like, God, yeah, I remember that. I'm good now.
Which goes back to what we say at the workshops, is that, you know, you can't go to the gym once and expect to be fit for life.
Absolutely.
You know, and it's the same with physical health, mental health. We have to work at it.
Yeah,
But the
definitely.
fact that you can now say I'm emetophobia free, because you can be around it, not worry about it,
Yeah.
your life isn't dominated around it, is just wonderful. Is there anything else you wanted to ask Charlotte?
No, I'm all right with that now.
Thank you.
I would like to just add something in very quickly,
Go on.
actually.
Yes.
Seeing as we're talking about the workshops,
Okay.
I think we should share a little exclusive.
Go on then, you go. Do you want to share?
Do you want me to do it?
You do it.
You don't know this either. We're actually hosting an emetophobia specific afternoon
Masterclass.
masterclass just for emetophobia.
How exciting.
Yes.
That would be so good.
If anyone wants details of that, if they just email our office or look at your website, nickandeva.com, N-I-K, nickandeva.com.
Yeah, we sort of figured that so many
yes,
people struggle with
that's
emetophobia, Charlotte, that it's and that so many people feel that there is no hope and that they can't get over it. That we feel that it's really important because, like Nick sort of said right at the beginning, as much as so many people have emetophobia, think that they're the only one, it is the most common phobia that we get asked about and that we treat and that we help with. And so we kind of figured, right, we need to do something about this.
Yeah.
And
So you're very welcome.
Fab.
yeah,
You want to come?
Absolutely.
you can come as our special guest.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
that would be great. So I must admit, the first video I put out after seeing you guys in my first workshop, inundated with people
Really?
saying, me too, me too, me too. And I never...
People don't talk about it though.
No.
And it's such a big surprise that,
Yeah.
that they found someone else who might have it. Yeah.
Which is why,
absolutely.
again, we just want to thank you
you.
so
Yeah,
much
thank you.
because
Thank
we
you so much for
know,
having me.
Charlotte, that you sharing your story with us today and it's going to give people hope. It's going to help them to realise that they
Absolutely.
don't have to live with it. And I think that you've spoken about it so eloquently and you've kind of everything that we hear, you've pretty much ticked all the boxes, and because everything that you've said you suffered with that you couldn't do, weren't able to do. Like I said, it does tick all those that what anybody else suffers with emetophobia will go, yes, that is me. But the most important thing for us is, and big thing, that we always go on about is the fact that there is always hope. You don't have to live with a phobia for all your life and the rest of your life, no matter what it is. So from all of
Absolutely.
us, huge thank you
You're
for
welcome. Thank
joining
you
us
so much.
today.
Thank
I've
you.
been a great guest, and most of all, just been a great ambassador for
Absolutely.
there's hope you can
Always.
get over emetophobia.
Yes.
Thank you so
definitely.
much.
Thank you so much for having
Thank
me.
you.
Thank you.
Hunter, you were in the room listening to Charlotte then. So is there anything particular that you thought was interesting about what she had to say?
I think the biggest thing really is just the importance of the timeline. I mean, we heard her say that she thought it was when she was in the cats when it started, and you can go your life focusing so much on that and trying to treat that one memory and that one like traumatic event. But if that's not the cause, it's really not going to get you far. I think that really is, a lot of people get stuck in therapy because they get over this one thing and they feel like they can't be helped because they've done so much, but really, if they're focused on the wrong area, they're never really gonna.
Yeah, I think that's
get
such a
over
good
it.
point. And it might even be something the therapist just told them is the thing that they think it
Yeah.
is, but obviously the therapist doesn't have the full
Exactly, they don't know
information
their
of that
life, do
person's
they?
life. Exactly. And I think that that's really important in terms of the timeline with what Charlotte was saying, because Charlotte is such a good example of how wide-reaching that emetophobia can be, more than any other potentially phobia there is. And I think that, from what she was saying, she could have been diagnosed with, she had insomnia, she said OCD, eating disorder, because, of her rituals and the things that she was writing down with her foods. Also, obviously, emetophobia, health anxiety. And I think that this is why emetophobia specifically is such a really hard one for people to correctly get the right therapy for, because of that umbrella of terms there. And, people see doctors and they get diagnosed with all those things that I've just said.
And flying phobia.
Oh, fear of flying, yes. She
flying.
would, and she also mentioned the cars, fear of driving. She would have had that as
Yeah,
well.
and I think the biggest umbrella of all that is generalized anxiety disorder and agoraphobia.
Yeah, and
When
that's
you
where
get to
it
the point
can
you can't
go
leave the
to.
house 'cause you don't feel
Absolutely.
safe.
And that's where it can go to. And then how does that make you feel when you've been told you've got potentially 8 symptoms there that we've listed? I mean, even as well, claustrophobia, because she said she was trapped in the car and she's transferred that anxiety about being sick to being in a car. And that's only even just what she's mentioned.
Yeah, and even being in public places, because she made a big thing about, I don't want to be seen to be sick. And that's the thing with emetophobia. There's different, depending on how your phobia started, people have different criteria, don't they?
But I think that's helpful for people listening, because that can give you a clue, that
Yes.
criteria. So what I mean by that, and if you were saying, for example, the criteria is I'm fine with other people being sick,
Yeah.
but I'm not okay if it's myself. For other people, it's I'm fine if it's other people, but I'm fine if it's myself, but I'm not okay if it's with other people. Equally, I've heard people say if it's an animal, I'm fine, but humans I can't cope.
Exactly.
Or if it's an animal, it's worse, which would suggest it started with an animal. So that actually can be quite helpful
Yes.
to question, you know, what are your abilities
Origin.
and not to help you find the origin.
Absolutely.
But I just think that it's so key for people listening, and I cannot stress this enough, not to feel that they're so broken because they've got so many labels, because that is what is such a huge thing with this phobia. It makes you feel like you have so many things wrong with you and it takes up so much of your life. But the bottom line is it comes down to one thing, and that is emetophobia. And if you deal with that emetophobia and you deal with the cause of that, all those other things can fall down, because the OCD, the health anxiety, all those things are just symptoms of emetophobia.
I think sometimes it might be helpful to look at it like it's a physical illness instead, because if you look at a physical illness, you can have loads of symptoms, but people just assume, they just know that once you deal with the main cause, all the symptoms are going to go away. And I feel like in mental health, that isn't the focus as much. It is more a focus of treating the symptoms individually, but not the overall thing. It's like that mindset isn't linked together like
and people
it is in
focus on
physical or
those
physical
labels
health.
as well, and that makes them feel, the labels of all those symptoms makes them feel so incredibly broken, because they can look at someone with a simple phobia and say, oh, you've just got fear or avoidance, whereas I've got all these things, but it's still one
Hunter
thing.
is spot on with that.
He is absolutely spot on. And one of the things with the emetophobia, in comparison with other phobias, it usually happens at a younger age. And this is why so many people say to us, I can't remember ever being without it.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of people with phobias can go, oh, well, yeah, I remember I was okay at one point, but and then the timeline can help you find out when did it change and what was the event. But emetophobia usually happens in a young age. And let's think about it, because parents aren't going to educate the small children and say, at some point in the future, you're going to be sick and it's going to feel like this and it's going to do that. And no one's ever going to have that conversation. So it happens in those most unfortunate situations, and parents trying to react quickly so the sick doesn't go in the carpet, or when act with that urgency, which can be misinterpreted as doing something wrong, so you never want to do that again. But it's interesting you say about symptoms, and just think about celebrities, because one celebrity that I've always known has suffered with OCD is Howie Mandel.
Oh, I've heard that.
And some of the things that he won't shake hands with people. There's so many things that he just won't do because he's got this issue with germs. And only recently I found out that he has emetophobia.
Really?
Yeah. So it could actually be
all emetophobia.
Yeah, but because
And
the
nothing
OCD
else. Yeah.
impacts his life externally more, because that's what people see. They
Interestingly,
assume it's OCD.
I heard another celebrity actually saying that she went on a podcast with him and she needed to cough, and she held her cough in the whole time because she didn't want to cough and upset him and make him feel anxious because of the germs. But that would make sense then, because being around, let's say he does have an issue with coughing, for example, being around people coughing is much more common, whereas being around people being sick is rare. So the emetophobia part of it might not affect him that much in his head, if that makes sense, because he's not being around that, whereas being around germs is constant, which is why that feels like his big thing.
Absolutely.
Even though it comes from the same place. But
equally, when people who have emetophobia hear somebody coughing violently, that can also trigger them, because it's got a similar sound to when you're about to vomit. So obviously, coughing can affect people. But another celebrity that I know of who publicly spoke out about emetophobia was the singer Anne-Marie. So that's another one, yes, definitely.
Yeah, and actually Kate Beckinsale.
Actress, anybody else know anybody else?
I mean, it's very common, and I think that's the bottom line. It is so common.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of people, it's more common than people realise, because a lot of people label it as other things as well.
Yeah.
But it is just so common.
There's Rochelle Humes as well, who's somebody that we spoke to, who used to have it, no longer. She's great. Yeah. Helped her gave her some tips on that one as well. So it is incredibly common, and it doesn't matter who you are. Nobody is immune at all. But I think for people who are listening and think, oh my goodness, I've got emetophobia and I don't know how it started. I suppose the important thing to share is that, look, you don't have to know how your phobia started. It does take longer to overcome a phobia when you don't know how it started. And just by definition, a phobia is an irrational fear. So when you know how it started, you can then start to rationalise with it. And I think common causes of emetophobia, and I think Charlotte was a great example.
I was just going to say, actually, because we do hear people often will start saying, oh, well, if I don't know how it started, does that mean I can never get over it? And I just think that's a really good point, that it doesn't mean you can't get over it. It just makes it so much easier to overcome when you do know the cause. And I think by giving common common causes might help people listening to sort of trigger off some ideas in their head of, oh, actually that happened to me, because we do find that often when people talk about causes. I mean, maybe even some people listening to Charlotte, that will have triggered some memories for them. But yeah, shall we just mention some common causes that often come up? Therefore, that might help people to sort of think, oh, actually that might have been me.
So,
a common one that people don't always see is copied behaviour, and a parent who has got emetophobia or not emetophobia as such, maybe an issue with germs or something, and then they might not have emetophobia, but then copying that behaviour then leads to, if it's something to do with germs, well, germs can make you ill and therefore make you sick, and I don't want that, so it can lead to emetophobia. But it's amazing, so many people that we've worked with who didn't realise that that's what the parents had.
So if it was a copied behaviour, what like things you could do to help you to overcome it would be to, I guess, appreciate it doesn't belong to you, is one thing. And like any phobia, the best way to overcome it is obviously challenge the origin, but then also look for the facts about the thing that you fear. And obviously vomit is a good thing.
Oh, vomit is a lifesaver. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And, you know, I think that when you realise that, you know, why would... Just think about it rationally. Why would you have an issue with anything that could save your life? You know, it is our first line of defence, you know, to make sure that we don't ingest poison.
I think that me and Hunter can say specifically me, really. I've had a lot of experiences with that because I have a nut allergy. And my own fault, I will say, I'm not the best at avoiding nuts because I'm sometimes just
getting on with life.
Sometimes I just think, I'll give that a go, I'll be fine. And look, I'm not advising that to anyone. That's absolutely the wrong thing to do. But I'm quite lucky that my allergy only results in vomiting. I don't get the throat swelling. So not that says you should ever do that. I'm not advising that to anybody.
No, but when you say you just give it a go, within your own restrictions.
Yes.
And with previous experience. And
yes,
so on,
absolutely. Not that it's a sensible thing to do anyway, I accept that. But I have had experiences of vomiting with my nut allergy, and that's the only time actually I've vomited is with a nut allergy because it is so rare. But in those experiences that has happened, I can categorically say that vomiting saved my life, and potentially, well, pretty much know that if I hadn't vomited, I would not be sat here right now because of my allergy. And you know, sometimes even with the best of avoidance, you can end up in situations where you ingest a nut, and it does happen. And you know, I do try and be careful, but you know, sometimes it does happen.
The thing is as well with vomiting, obviously you're trying to get it out, and getting it out makes you feel better. So if you keep it in, if you weren't to vomit, you'd feel worse for a longer period of time because
your body only does it when it has to.
Yeah, exactly. But you keep it in there for longer, so you're going to feel worse.
And if it gets through to your bowel, then you get diarrhea.
Exactly.
Right? Because your body's trying to get rid of this poison, and you can have diarrhea for a lot longer than you would do.
Stomach aches will cause inflammation, and it's just not going to be. It's easier to throw up.
But also, interestingly, Science Corner, I actually read a really interesting bit of science about vomiting and the fact that not only does it make you feel better because you've got the toxin out of your system, which your body needs to get out, which is why it's getting rid of it, and it's much more effective if it gets it out through vomiting rather than it going through your system because it just comes out sooner. But also, when you are actually sick, your brain releases you release endorphins into the body that feel good chemicals, actually make you feel better once you've been sick.
Wow.
So you get a little self-soothe.
Bit of a buzz.
I did not
after
know
being sick.
that.
No,
That
I know.
is so fascinating. So common causes, and interesting about the poison thing. I remember, and it was 10 years ago, and we heard from, I know a lot of people watched a show that we did. It was 10 years ago, I think, called the Speakmans, and I think that we've actually got this on our YouTube channel as well. And Becky Bella, and she had really severe emetophobia, couldn't leave the house. She'd burnt her tummy with hot water bottles, etc. And her phobia started because when she was a little girl, she drank a bottle of Calpol. She was only about 2, 3, and it was again her mum's reaction. Her mum scooped her up. There was this urgent drive to the hospital, and when she sort of looked back, that was what she recalls more than anything, but obviously was given a vomit-inducing drug to save her life.
And I think parental reactions is such a big, and not just parents, but if people can consider others' reactions generally.
Teacher.
I remember working with a guy in clinic who came to me with emetophobia, and his installation was he had been in a group with friends, and he was only a kid, another young kid had fallen, fainted, and fell on top of him, and everybody was like, oh my God, fussing this kid. And he thought, oh, that's so embarrassing. I wouldn't wouldn't want to faint. So he said to his mum, how would I know if I was going to faint? And she said, oh, you'd know because you'd feel sick. And so he then thought to himself, if I feel sick, I'm going to have this big reaction, this big embarrassment. Everyone's going to look at me because I'm going to faint. So then he created emetophobia from that. So I think considering other people's reactions is really, really big.
And embarrassment is one, again,
Within that,
embarrassment is a really common cause of people having emetophobia and fear of being sick, and not necessarily them being sick and being embarrassed, but seeing another child in class throwing up and everybody going, and then as a kid you think, oh my God, I don't want that to happen to me. And then, do you remember, Nick, there was a lady that came to one of our workshops many years ago, and she'd had emetophobia for something like 80 years. And do you remember, wasn't it something like her dad, she'd seen her dad be sick and she thought that he was dying, and that was...
I do. She was 85. And she said, no, sorry, she was 86, and she said it happened when she was 4. And I remember because she said Dad came home, he'd been out, and he was being sick, and because he'd had red wine, she thought he was dying, and she'd had it all that time. And what we pointed out to her was, well, actually, and how long was your dad in your life after that? And he was in her life after that for almost 50 years. And we made her realise that actually by a dad vomiting, he was with her for 50 years, where had he not done, he probably would have died of alcohol poisoning. And it made, and that switch was incredible that she'd had this for so long. But also, I don't know if you remember working with someone either who had been really ill. And I think, if I remember right, he'd had measles or something like that, and people said to him that he'd been sick, and the measles was so bad, or it was scarlet fever or something like that. He'd been so ill with it, but people didn't say ill. He used the word sick.
Do you not think as well
the
that's common with a
terminology.
lot of Scottish people that we work with? They tend to use, in Scottish terminology, they tend to use the word sick for illness.
Yes.
And I've
American
noticed...
thing as well.
Oh, is it?
I
In
say
America
sick.
as well?
I say sick.
Right,
No.
got you, yeah. So, oh, look at you.
No,
I say
sorry.
that now.
No, I'm saying
No, I'm
because
American.
That's what they all say.
No, I'm
so.
American.
So Americans don't say I'm ill?
No, so I'm sick.
But that's the same with Scottish people that we work with.
And what
it's the
happened with
same.
him, so he'd never been sick. It was nothing to do with vomiting.
But they'd use the word.
But they'd use the word sick, and that linked to how ill he felt, even though he'd not been vomiting.
But this is a brilliant example. And look, we're not playing it down because it's a very, very severe and unpleasant phobia, but it just is a great example how every time we work with somebody with a fear of vomit, it's always realistically based on a misunderstanding of an event when you're a child, and it's because you're so young and you don't understand that you then create this avoidance. And because another example is when, for many people we've worked with, again, another cause, being sick on their own when they're little and then not being a grown up there, and then being confused and not understanding, and therefore being fearful, not so much of the vomit, but
being on their own.
Being on their own. So these are all common causes.
And that's the thing. It's like I said with Charlotte before, it's about looking at what was traumatic then, not now, because now you might think, oh, well, that's not a big deal, but it's not about that. It's about in that moment, what do you set up?
And that was interesting because Charlotte was looking back on some of those memories, and they weren't a big deal, but it's how it felt then. And, you know, I know she's been very kind to her dad, and, you know, my dad didn't mean it, because that's her rationalising as an adult. And we know Dad didn't mean it, but it's just the urgency and not knowing what to do.
That's why people can feel frustrated with themselves in adulthood, because they can have partners, friends, you know, people around them that will go, but it's not that bad. It's there to save your life. And they'll go, well, I know that. And it's like that because the adult knows that, but they've not dealt with what the child understood or thought in that moment.
And just something that I wanted to touch on is in regards to health anxiety, because I know that a lot of people who have emetophobia believe they have health anxiety, but actually what they're doing is avoiding any time that they could be ill and possibly then vomit. But even with health anxiety, even if it's a standalone health anxiety, again, it's a similar kind of procedure, isn't it? Because it all comes from something you've experienced in your life, and then and it is just sort of unpicking that. So before we sort of start to collate and conclude with our tips for our handbook to happiness for anybody who struggles with emetophobia, is there anything that anybody wanted to add?
I just want to add one more thing about the timeline, because I know, I'm just thinking about what people say to us. One of the things that people often say is, but I can't remember my childhood. I can't remember. How can I put a timeline together when I don't have memories, or I don't remember this? And we hear that often as well. And so I just want to sort of touch on that if that's you, then one really helpful thing to consider is, because often people say, oh, I don't remember, I don't have memories. But then when you ask them questions sort of, well, you know, who was your teacher in school, or who was your best friend in school, that they do actually remember those things. But if you don't know what you're looking for, it's harder to find. So one thing that can really help if that's you is to, when you're writing your timeline, look at specifics, break it down and go, right, what do I remember from nursery? What do I remember from being little in that school that I went to in that primary school? What do I remember from that year? Who was my best friend at that time? And just going through it that way can really help to prompt things that could have occurred in that
I think as
timeframe.
well, especially when I've done my timeline before, initially it doesn't always come to you straight away. But
Absolutely.
being open to those ideas and appreciating the fact that you do know them, they're in there somewhere. There's been a lot of times where I've done my timeline and then a couple of days later, a day later, I've been lying in bed. I've gone, oh my God, I forgot about
Same.
that. And that's just coming to me. And just be open to new ideas and things. They will
Yeah.
come to you eventually. It's just...
Yeah,
being a bit
that's a
patient
really
with
good
it.
point, is being open to it, being patient with it and adding to it as you go.
That's very true. And the key to unlocking that door, because our brain accepts commands. If you say, I've just no idea when it started, your brain will go, okay, then I won't give you the answer because it does have the answer. So the best key to, if that's you, is to feed back those words and add on the end, but if I did know. So if you say, I just don't know when this started, I know I don't know when this started, but if I did know, when could it be? And by doing that, that cuts round you previously saying you didn't know, and you'd be surprised how something will pop into your mind.
You gave a good analogy once about a Google search.
Just
It's like
once. That-
just once.
Just once,
This
do
one
that.
time.
Yeah.
I commemorated it. I wrote it down. No, there's one time you said.
I remember saying that.
Yeah. No, but I thought it was a really
Yeah.
good point, which is like, if you go searching for something in Google, you can search for it forever if you're not searching the right thing. We've all had that frustration
Yeah.
where you're thinking like, I can't think of what I'm trying to ask for, because, you know, I always quite like that Google
Yeah.
feature now, that hum that tune. Have you seen it, where you can hum a tune into Google and it'll tell you what the song is,
didn't
which
know
is
that.
so good, because if you can hear a tune but you can't think of the words, how do you find it? How do you find the song?
Yeah.
And it's that same thing, that if you don't know what you're looking for, or you don't know what question to ask, you're not going to find it. So just by, like Hunter said, not putting pressure on yourself, just considering, right, what do I remember of other people being sick? When do I remember of me being sick? When's the, you know, going back to specific memories, and like you said, asking yourself, if I don't know, if I did, you know, I know I don't know, but if I did, what might it be? Can
Yeah.
be really helpful.
Absolutely.
Take your time with it.
Definitely. Right. So does any, Hunter, do you
Yes.
have anything in regard to emetophobia? And obviously, look, us three are therapists and we face this on a daily basis, and you don't. But from what you've heard today, is there anything that you would specifically like to add to this page of our handbook to happiness?
I mean, maybe not specifically to emetophobia, but just the things I've said already, really, on the whole of just helping to get over any phobia, but emetophobia as well, just with the timeline, how important it is, being open to those ideas, realizing that there's not one specific, that if you've got those symptoms, could just be one thing. If you deal with that, it's all going to fall away. Yeah, just everything that I've said, really,
Yeah.
I think.
Liv, what do you would like?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And once you've done that timeline, that is the absolute key start. And then you can take that to a therapist, and that will be much more successful than kind of a therapist who only sees you for a set amount of time, sort of trying to find the bit that's important and find that key bit. So it's really helpful to do that timeline, really strip it back, take your time with it, don't put pressure on yourself, and look for what that first memory was. And remember, it might not be something that happened to you, it might be something that happened to somebody else, and really finding what that is. And then once you find what that is, you can go and get therapy on that specific, and that's going to be far more successful. And just one final message is, you know, I just want to really echo what Hunter said, because I think it's so important with this phobia specifically, is not to feel overwhelmed by all these labels, all these symptoms, all the things that are going on, because it doesn't matter whether you've got one label or you've got 10. If you get to the root cause and you deal with it and you knock it down, then it all falls apart.
Yeah. And my dear Nick sat there.
Yes, well, yeah, trying to get a word in. You know, I would say, look, if you're suffering with emetophobia, please be reassured that you can get better, because, you know, we've worked with thousands of people with emetophobia over the years, and, you know, whilst there are commonalities that we've discussed, how these emetophobia can be created, everything is individual, and once you find what caused yours and you deal with that, you can 100% get over it, like Charlotte said earlier.
Yeah. And apologies, but I feel very passionate about this topic of emetophobia. And so I've got a couple of things that I'd just like to say. Number one is be careful that you don't misinterpret the start of your phobia actually being your first phobic response. That is really important. So if you just remember something when you reacted badly, that would suggest that it was already there. Otherwise, you wouldn't have reacted quite so badly. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. Second thing I'd like to say is don't feed it. What do I mean by that? And that is that when somebody has emetophobia, they quite often look for reasons why they should keep it. Of course, you don't want it, but reasons to excuse it and to back it up, as opposed to why you should get rid of it. A lot of people say, oh yeah, but it's because I need to be in control. That is just an excuse. The truth is just vomit. That is the thing. So don't try and feed it with looking for case studies of people who have been sick, people locally or people at your children's school who have been sick. Try looking for the people that haven't been sick. And that's what I mean by don't feed it. Look for the facts as opposed to, the positive facts. So that's something that's really important. And my final thing is that keep a list. Get a piece of A4 paper, split it in half. On the left side, write fear, on the right side, write fact, and whatever it is, that internal dialogue that you are saying that is negative about vomit, write that in the fear section. And then you've got to look for something positive about vomit to counteract the negative. Like Nick said, and like we've all said, look, nobody wants to be sick. Nobody enjoys it. But equally, as Liv mentioned in Science Corner, it gives you a feel-good hormone because actually it's really good for you. We're rarely sick. We rarely vomit, but when we do, it's because our body is trying to protect us against a toxin. Your body isn't trying to fight against you. And when you can collate enough contrapositive evidence, no matter how long you've suffered, no matter how much it consumes your life, you can get over emetophobia. And that is why, and what we're going to be teaching at our new masterclass. And if you'd like some information about that, please don't suffer. Drop us an email, events@speakman.tv, or look at our website and do listen to this entire podcast series because we are sharing lots of information that, okay, it might not just be emetophobia, but it'll be certainly things to help. Thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate your time and joining us. And don't forget, 5-star review would be great if you don't mind. Thanks a million.
Thanks so much for joining us. Wherever you're listening to this podcast today, do be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and we'd be incredibly grateful of a 5-star review.
Oh, and don't forget to recommend our podcast to your family and friends.
And if you'd like to have a look at some more free resources, take a look at our website, nickandeva.com.
If you want to drop us a question, we'd love to hear from you. Send it to admin@speakman.tv.
And you can follow us. We're at The Speakmans on all social media platforms. On YouTube, we're Handbook to Happiness Pod. If you are struggling, do be sure to speak to your general practitioner. And all that's left to say is that we appreciate you spending time with us today.